Welcome and thank you for joining us today for a discussion on the newly launched project examining the pathway to zero greenhouse gas emissions for the cooling sector, a collaboration with the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, Cool Coalition, Carbon Trust, and the UNFCCC COP26 Champions team. My name is Lily Riahi, and I'm the coordinator of the UNEP-led Cool Coalition, one of the official outcomes and transformative initiatives put forward by the Executive Office of the Secretary General for the UN Climate Action Summit in New York. Today, I'm your MC for this exciting, informative webinar where you'll hear more about the Pathway to Zero for Cooling project from Dan Hamza, Non-Executive Director, KSEP, and a member of the COP26 Champions team. You'll also hear from him how you can participate and get involved in this project. We'll then hear from Nicholas Svenningsson from the UNFCCC about the links between this project and the Marrakech Partnership for Global Climate Action, and in particular, the climate action pathways. David Aitken from the Carbon Trust will provide us with early insights for the research that has been done on the pathway to zero for cooling. We will then have a Q&A session to hear from you on your thoughts and recommended actions as we get started on the pathway work. For this, please make use of the chat box on the left. And if you are dialing in, you can also press *6 to unmute or mute yourself, and *4 for a range of commands on the phone. This will then be followed after the Q&A by closing remarks by Mark Radka, Chief of the Climate and Energy Branch at UNEP. So before we get started on this exciting webinar, I was asked by Dan to give a bit of scene setting. And so I'll take the next few minutes to highlight the need for ambition on cooling in light of the climate emergency and COVID-19 recovery. The first point is, of course, that we cannot solve the climate crisis without reducing emissions from cooling. I'm sure today we have with us some European attendees who are perhaps sweltering through the heat waves. If you have AC, you've probably cranked it up throughout the workday in your home office or to get a good night's sleep. But of course, cooling is much more than thermal comfort. It's also about protecting vulnerable populations. It's about keeping vaccines viable, food fresh from farm to fork, and workforces productive. So that means that to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement, we will need to expand access to cooling, even beyond the growth that's already happening thanks to urbanization and rising populations. But we'll need to do so in a climate-friendly manner. Because at the moment, with the business as usual, keeping cool is actually making our planet hot. If you think about conventional cooling right now, so refrigeration, air conditioning, and fans, that is causing already 10% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. We've all heard the figures from the IEA that by 2050, just space cooling, not including cold chain, demand will triple, and this segment alone will consume as much electricity as China and India today, just to get your head around what that number will look like. And this, of course, doesn't account for the demand to deliver on the SDGs, which would mean growth would be even higher. And at the moment, direct and indirect emissions from the AC and refrigeration, air conditioning refrigeration, are projected to rise 90% from 2017 levels by the same date. That would be the equivalent of 12 gigaton CO2 equivalent in 2050. So if anything, these numbers should make clear that cooling really has to be at the front and center in the discussion as we look to meet the 1.5 degree target. So to solve this, of course, dilemma between needing to deliver on the SDGs and the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development and the Paris Climate Agreement, we really need a rapid transition to climate-friendly and energy-efficient cooling. And making this transition happen is the raison d'etre of the Cool Coalition, an effort of over 100 stakeholders, many of you with us today, including governments, cities, businesses, finance, development organizations, civil society. And so how are we going about, or how do we go about doing this transition? it won't be one solution, and we will definitely need to achieve it through a range of approaches and actors. Some, for example, will think that we can just green this growth in power demand through renewable energy. Well, if you look at 2018, for example, which was a record-breaking year for solar energy, the demand for new AC in buildings offset all of that new capacity that was added to the grid. So relying on renewables would mean that we couldn't, to green the cooling demand would mean we wouldn't be able to achieve our ambitions for a net zero electricity system. So we need to think about a range of solutions. We need to think about how to reduce demand through smart buildings, urban form, land use, nature-based solutions, as well as, of course, how to improve energy efficiency and shift to renewable energy. And we need to tackle cooling across all the sectors, not only energy, but transport, buildings, cities, and in industry. Crucially, there's also a unique opportunity, of course, with the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, which is phasing down HFCs, climate warming gases that are used in the cooling industry. And the phase down alone of HFCs could achieve a 0.4 degree of global warming by the end of the century. So by coupling efforts on energy efficiency with this phase down, we can enhance the climate benefits from the Kigali Amendment. So through the Cool Coalition, we have brought together the actors from the different sectors to decarbonize the sector, but we will need to understand the contributions that the different stakeholders, organizations, and actors can make. And we hope to set out the actions needed to achieve a zero emission pathway with all of you here together today. And we'll be setting up a Cool Coalition working group to do so. Then we can, as the community, Cool Coalition community, together with all the stakeholders, share, advocate, and act on cooling in an even more impactful way on the road to COP26 and beyond. So without further ado, I will hand over to Dan to give us more details on how we plan to do that. Over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Lily. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. And Marco, do I have control of the slides?
Yes, you do.
Okay, let's go. Right. Well, hi everyone. I hope you're all well and managing in these difficult times. I mean, it's great to be having this discussion, despite what's happened with COVID and the obvious need to focus attention on addressing the health crisis and the short term, it seems, reduction in emissions. To echo Lily, the climate crisis has not gone away, and as we come out of the health crisis, there is a need to double down on our efforts and to absolutely pick up the pace. And countries and non-state actors are doing that in their own individual ways, but we have the chance to come back together collectively to do that now as a global community for COP26, which has been rescheduled to the end of 2021, to November 2021. And the totality of the impact of the COP, of any COP, is a combination of the negotiated outcomes that parties achieve, as well as the level of ambition they want to put in their NDCs and any associated government-led campaigns, and also the commitments that non-state actors make, non-state actors being at least businesses, investors, cities, states, regions, universities, think tanks, NGOs, and various others. So let's see if the slide works. I have pressed the button. I'll press it again.
You click on the screen and press the. There you go. Yeah.
Press it again. Yay. Okay, great. Yeah. So building on COP25, at COP25, the Climate Ambition Alliance was launched by the UNFCCC high-level champion for COP25, Gonzalo Munoz. And for COP26, to build on the Climate Ambition Alliance, a race to zero has been launched to essentially accelerate commitments through until November next year. And this was launched about 3 weeks ago. And at the firing of the starting gun, we have a pretty impressive lineup in the race already. 995 businesses, cities, investors, regions, universities. You can see the numbers. What is that? 2,000 or so members of the race to zero, and they've all committed to net zero. This campaign will be taken forward over the next 18 months, and then who knows where it goes after COP26, led by the high-level climate champions. Now for the UK's COP presidency, that's Nigel Topping, still working with Gonzalo Munoz from the Chilean-led COP25. Focus on increasing these commitments and building the momentum that we very much need. And I mean, I thought this was wonderful news. I don't know about you, but when I saw this number, I was like, wow, nearly 50% of global GDP covered by net zero commitments. And you know, have a look at the website, everybody. Have a look and see how this all adds up. You've got a combination, obviously, of large subnational entities like California, and then the investors and the businesses around the world. Takes us to a pretty good place, but not enough. So more needed over the months and years ahead. Let's see if it takes me to the next slide. Do I need to click on the screen again?
Yes, it should be okay. If not, I can pass the slides.
Yeah, maybe you should do it, Marco. It doesn't like me.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Right. Race to Zero, how to join. A repeat of who the non-state actors are: businesses, cities, regions, investors, and others. Can join by being included in an existing initiative. So just so everyone understands how this has happened, the Race to Zero is an aggregator and an escalator of ambition. And what was sort of identified was that across the efforts that are happening globally, a lot of initiatives are pushing in the same direction, but using slightly different framing, communications, and methodology. So if you think commitments to net zero, or as Greta would say, commitments to real zero, commitments to carbon neutrality, commitments to go carbon positive, commitments to set a science-based target, etc. Okay, they're all pushing in the same direction, and an assessment was made to understand what was actually going on, and when you lift up the bonnet or the hood, as the Americans say, and see what's going on underneath, and then to put a wrapper around that and to say, okay, is it all scientifically robust? You know, what does it qualify, not qualify? And to therefore come up with those initiatives and associated non-state actors that are actually already in the race to zero. So it's not an exhaustive list. I've given a couple of examples there. There are more on the website. Have a look at the UNFCCC. New partners are absolutely welcome from the sort of initiative perspective, so equivalents of your SBTI, B Corp, C40, under 2, etc. But of course, more non-state actors are also needed too. Okay, so where does this lead us for cooling? Marco, next slide. Well, I think it sort of throws a question to us as a community, and certainly, you know, this kind of sort of one of those light bulb moments for myself, having worked with all of you with your great efforts on cooling. You know, we've been definitely, you know, moving things forward in terms of policy interventions, technology progress, financial commitments, and more. But potentially without a North Star, and potentially also without enough consistency across what we're doing to know that we're really going to achieve the ambition that the world needs of us in terms of reducing emissions from cooling. And so that led us to posing the question of, you know, what does net zero look like for cooling? What does a race to zero look like for cooling? And we don't have the answer in our back pocket. So today we're going to hear from David and co about the plan to get the answer, which we're very keen to work with as many of you on as possible. And that effort it is happening within the context of COP26. I should also flag that a number of our core funders for KSEP sponsoring this, so thank you to the funders of KSEP. A number of our core funders did say, you know, what's the big picture on cooling? Where's it going? You know, they're looking at what's happening on electric vehicles, you know, the end of the internal combustion engine and transitioning to EVs. They can see the big picture. So they threw the challenge at us. What's the big picture for cooling? Where's it all going? What's the pathway? So we had this kind of double whammy of, you know, funder interest and also the zeitgeist for COP26 and this movement around the world to net zero led us to say, well, we better do something about it, right? We need to do some homework. So the way we're planning on going about this is in sort of support of and alignment with the existing efforts of the Marrakech Partnership to the UNFCCC, which Nicholas will talk about a bit in a minute in terms of following an established approach and methodology. And as Lily mentioned, we'll set up a cool coalition stakeholder working group to bring those of you together that want to work with us on this. But we are now really keen to get the feedback on this is how we think we can tackle this fairly big question. And there are some question marks. Can we genuinely get to real zero? Would this pass the Greta test, or does net zero for cooling require an element of offsetting, and if so, why and where, and how big is that, and how does that land with the offsetting that may be coming from other sectors like aviation, or from difficult parts of agriculture, industrial processes, or from shipping? Because over the years and still now, there are requests in our system for a bit of help in terms of not getting to zero. And if it doesn't all add up, then well, we need to know that, and we need to be honest about that, and see how close we can get. So I'm really excited by this. I think it's a great opportunity for us to further consolidate the work that we're doing. For the Cool Coalition essentially has kind of done what the Race to Zero has done at the meta level. If you think about the Cool Coalition, recognize that numerous organizations, many of which are on this call, we're working on efficient, climate-friendly, sustainable, clean cooling. We've all talked about how to define it. And yet weren't working sufficiently in unison, weren't working sufficiently with a North Star and with consistency about what we're doing. That's why we've got the model MEPs. That's why we've developed various assets for the community. So I feel like we've brought everyone together, done a great job, and we are one of the entities that's been recognized by this meta level effort, because this same conversation is going on for transport, it's going on for energy, it's going on for agriculture and land use and so forth. And we are basically representing that community on cooling, and need to come up with our best offer, the pathway to zero for cooling, to aim to launch in September as part of the launching of a suite of other pathways, and a further sort of escalation, but also a deeper dive into the key sectors that actually can result in our transformation to net zero globally. And so I'm not sure exactly how it comes together in September yet. The details will come clear over the months ahead. And then in November, for those that haven't heard, there's likely to be a set of dialogues at the moment, is the way they're being referred to, for non-state actors, certainly, and I think there'll be some government involvement as not a replacement for the COP, because it's absolutely not a formal replacement for the COP, but as a way of recognizing we've had to defer the COP, but we need to maintain momentum, we need to maintain engagement, particularly of developing countries, of all the voices that make this happen. So keep an eye out for what's going to happen in November. That will be another stepping stone from the launch in September, and onwards we go through to our next big global moment next year. So that's what I wanted to say by way of framing. Lily, thank you for setting all of this up. Thank you, David and co, for doing all the legwork. I'm going to pass back, I think, now to Lily to hear from Nicholas before we then get into the presentation from David. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Dan. I think now I'll pass it over to Nicholas to give an overview of cooling and the Marrakech Partnership for Global Climate Action. Over to you.
Okay, thank you so very much, and hello everybody. It's really nice to have this opportunity to share a little bit of what we are doing here in UNFCCC. Let me just see if I have control of the PowerPoint. I think I should have that. It worked before. Hold on, try this again. Okay. Nope. There it comes. Okay, fantastic. Okay, great, good. So my name is Nicholas Henningsen. I am working at the Climate Change Secretariat, the Secretariat to UNFCCC. I'm based here in Bonn, in Germany, and my job is to guide our work related to global climate action. I want to start with some basics, really, and I apologize for maybe saying something that you already know, but well, that's part of being part of this webinar, perhaps. So what you already know is, of course, this. You know that we have something called global climate change. This figure is just, one of thousands of graphs that is illustrating what is happening. The blue line is basically showing the temperature change we would have with natural occurring incidents such as volcanic eruptions, etc. The orange one is human-induced, what it would be if we would just looked on the human-induced emissions to the atmosphere and cutting down or removing carbon sinks. And the red one is combined effect. So what we see is, of course, that we do have an increased climate change, and we have monthly observations, the black line here, which is basically supporting the theory. So when theory matches the evidence and observations, that's called science. So that is what we have. Now, the problem with science and in climate change especially is that we talk about very long-term processes that take a long time to happen, and it takes a long time before people really see it. So if you have a hot summer day, as you may have here in Bonn today, it's 28 degrees. The normal temperature in June in Bonn is actually 16.7 degrees Celsius. I have lived here for 10 years, and it's kind of normal. It's getting a little bit hotter every summer. But if you look on what is actually happening, and we have had, this is from an article in Science, where they have been taking the European summer temperature track record for the last 500 years, up to 2010. And what you can see here is that while we of course have a bell curve, which is normal if you take the average of anything, you will see that the outliers on the hot side are all happening in the last decades. And this doesn't include the record heat summers we had in 2015, 2018, 2019. Now, why I'm saying this? Why I'm saying this is that, just to make the point, it's getting hotter and cooling is becoming a more important issue. This is no longer only something that you would look for keeping your food fresh and people keeping houses comfortable in the tropics. This is an issue that this and technology that is going to be more and more used for sure. So since we now know that we have climate change going on, let me move over very quickly to UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is a UN organization that is supporting the intergovernmental process on climate negotiations. We are mostly known for our Conference of the Parties, our annual big events, which are typically happening at the end of the year. In a normal COP, we would have up to 30,000, sometimes more participants. Well, we're saying it's one meeting. We're actually running more than 1,000 negotiation-related meetings, plus almost the same amount of side events and other events. We typically are trying to get through about 250 agenda issues, and I didn't think we ever really managed that, but that is ambition. Last year, we had COP25, hosted by Chile, but happening in Madrid due to the civil unrest in Chile. And this year, we are going to have it in Glasgow in November. But because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have decided to move that until next year. We just push it 1 year ahead. And in fact, many of our meetings are also being pushed into the future, or like in this case, moved over to the virtual space. The purpose of these meetings and of the whole UNFCCC process from the beginning has been to develop and implement an international agreement on climate change. And that agreement, of course, is the Paris Agreement, which was adopted in 2015 in well, Paris, obviously. I'm not going to tell you what it is, because I think everybody on this webinar probably knows what it is, but in a short, you know, in a nutshell, it can be seen as a global blueprint for how nations, the countries of the world, will work together to contain climate change so that it does not exceed 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and ideally not more than 1.5 degrees. It's not a top-down protocol like the Kyoto Protocol was, but it's really owned by every government. Every government had to develop a national climate plan. We call it a natural determined contribution, an NDC. And the implementation of those NDCs, and they look very, very differently from country to country, is not only a plan for the government, it's really a plan for everybody, for the private sector, for civil society, and so on. So the Paris Agreement, adopted in 2015, how is it actually going? Well, I come from Sweden, so I have to show you this. If you're familiar with IKEA, the Swedish furniture store, you will know that if you go into an IKEA store and buy piece of furniture, in this case a bookshelf called Billy, you go and pick it up, you have it packaged, and you come home, and when you come home and open up your bookshelf, it turns out that there's no bookshelf there. It is a number of pieces that needs to be put together. Now, the Paris Agreement is the same. I'm not saying that IKEA did the Paris Agreement, but there are clear similarities. So you need this instruction to be able to make the Paris Agreement work. And the instruction in the UNFCCC world is called the Paris Rulebook. So that is what our partners have been working on to a large extent for the last couple of years. We are almost there. We are missing one or two small pictures there to make it complete, but we're quite positive that this will be done at our next COP. Now, something else that the Paris Agreement is putting in place, as I said, is the fact that the Paris Agreement, while it's an agreement between national government, it addresses everybody, it invites everybody to support this. So we are using the term global climate action to describe the work by everybody who is not a government. So our parties have decided they should be called non-party stakeholders, but we're talking about private sector, civil society, cities, organizations, even individuals like you and me. The purpose of climate action in the Paris Agreement and in the UNFCCC process is to catalyze and facilitate the implementation of the Paris Agreement. It is guided by two high-level champions, as Dan mentioned, who are guiding how we are really engaging with these two. And I'm coming back to our two high-level champions in a moment. In UNFCCC, we actually have a quite wide range of activities that in different ways are trying to catalyze this climate action. We are not an implementing organization. We are not like UNEP or UNDP who would go out and do projects on the ground, but we are trying to support other organizations that are doing this. We are working with sectors. We are working on awards on tracking, reporting, and so on. One of the key components of our work, however, is the Marrakech Partnership for Global Climate Action. It was launched by our champions in 2016, the year after the Paris Agreement. And the purpose of this is to coordinate a broad coalition of different non-party stakeholder actors across specific thematic areas to work together to develop plans and methods for implementing the Paris Agreement in their sectors. Essentially, this translates to this race to zero that Dan was mentioning, to have a clear roadmap for how you are going to keep your contribution to the global warming below 1.5 degrees. And next slide. Here it comes. Okay, so these are our two climate champions, Nigel Topping from UK and Gonzalo Muñez from Chile. They're always nominated by the current presidency, so right now Chile, and the incoming presidency, UK. So typically champions would serve for 2 years and then they would shift over to somebody else. So they are looking after a very wide range of activities, including the thematic areas in the Marrakech Partnership. The thematic areas are energy, transport, industry, human settlements, land use, water, and ocean. But there are much more into that also. We're including finance, adaptation, resilience, and we're looking into subsectors on sustainable buildings, for example. A key tool that the Marrakech Partnership developed last year was the climate action pathways. So the climate action pathways are, so the climate action pathways are really pathways that are aimed to inspire and help parties and others who are concerned, if you're in the energy sector, if you're in the building sector, transport sector, to identify actions that they can undertake to reduce the impact on the climate. And they're also intended to feed into the development of naturally determined contributions to the national action plans, as well as the long-term strategies for greenhouse gas development. So they outlines a longer-term vision for the 1.5 degree climate resilient world and sets out actions, as I said, that are needed for the future. Now, it's a little bit delay here, so hopefully it will come in a second. Here, okay. So if you look into one of these pathways, which you can find on the UNFCCC website, among other places, you will find both statistics, recommended policies, specific technologies, and so on that you can do. This is just a short snapshot from the energy transition pathway, which is showing where we are generating energy-related emissions You can see it comes from buildings, from transport, from district heating, power generation, and from industry. And then in this pathway, you will also have identified specific actions in buildings, transports, district heating, and these areas for how you can reduce emissions. You also have a translation that says this much is achieved through electrification, this much is achieved through efficiency improvement, this much is achieved through renewable energy. We have received very, very good feedback to these pathways, but we also realize that they can be better. And this is one of the big things that we're trying to do this year, the Marrakech Partnership, UNFCCC, and our champions. So for 2020, 2021, up to next COP, the idea is really to enhance the quality and consistency of these pathways, to increase how it can be used, especially by being more specific on what can you do in different subsectors, and what can you do in different kind of economies, and what can you do in different parts of the world, because these pathways will look differently depending on where you are and who you are. And maybe two things to say here. Of course, these are science-based. This is not something that we're dreaming up. This is something that is well anchored in science and is well anchored in a confidence that what is recommended is something that really, really works. One of the subsectors we do want to look into, and thanks to the ladies and gentlemen on this call also, is cooling. So cooling is, of course, a very important area, as I said, not only because the world is getting hotter, but because also it has a large climate footprint. In addition to the links, of course, to the Montreal Protocol and the Kigali Amendment in terms of affecting how it's affecting the ozone layer. So global climate action in UNFCCC in 2020, this year, is an important year for our NDC process. Parties are supposed to provide either updated or brand new NDCs. They're supposed to do that every 5 years in 5-year cycles, and this is the first year that this should happen. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we know that these NDCs have, they need to be rethought. And not in a way where you are actually lessening your ambition, but where you are increasing the ambition. Because the silver lining of the COVID cloud is really that we have put a halt to a large part of society, and we will need to restart it. And we can restart it in different ways. And one way is by directing investment and green recovery measures into sectors that are helping us to build a more resilient and climate-friendly society. And obviously, cooling is part of that as well. And what is interesting here is that if you look back to our last crisis, which doesn't look like such a big crisis now, is the 2008 financial crisis. And what we know is that the recovery financing that has already been pledged today, and most of it has not been pledged, is exceeding the 2008 recovery finance by more than 10 times. So this is actually quite a big opportunity. Okay, moving over to the next slide here, I hope. Okay, here we are. Okay, good. So who are these climate action pathways for? Well, first of all, national governments. We do want them to be aware about what they can do to implement climate action in sectors, in this case, in the cooling sector. What are the measures, the technical, practical measures, the policies, the carrots and sticks that you can use to actually bend the curve and reduce the climate footprint and make it climate neutral? The private sector is, of course, a big stakeholder, because they are the ones who will not only need to provide the technology and the services and the products, but also needs to promote this to the end users, which is you and I. Civil society, of course, has a big role in engaging and informing everybody, the end user consumers. And we can, of course, the day when we are looking at buying a new fridge or air conditioning unit or whatever it is, really think about, okay, what is the climate footprint of this? This is what we hope would happen. And So I said what we're doing here also in UNFCCC is that we are tracking the number of climate action commitments by non-party stakeholders. So we have something called the Global Climate Action Portal. It used to be called NASCA, but it was a difficult name. So we just call it Global Climate Action Portal today. Today we're tracking some 18,000 actions and commitments, 26,000, almost 27,000 action and commitments by some 18,000 different actors. And this is really everybody. It's international coalitions, it is cities, it is private sectors who are undertaking action in different areas. And what we hope to see, of course, is that one effect of this cooling pathway should be to increase the number of commitments in that aspect as well. So finally, what we expect and what we hope that the cooling pathway will be is something that allows translation both upwards to policymakers and governments and downwards to the private sector, to end users and to everybody else. It also needs to be relevant to other actors. The cooling climate action pathways needs to link also with the other pathways that we're having in buildings or in transport or similar. And I think thanks to the Marrakech Partnership, that is something that will happen. This is something that is under the United Nations, not only UNFCCC, but UNEP and other UN organizations that are engaging on this as well. And as I said, we hope this can help to design the future indices. The COVID-19 pandemic is providing a unique situation. I think that these pathways will be much more implementable than ever as part of the green recovery after COVID. Winston Churchill said, never let a good crisis go to loss or go to waste. And I think although there's very little positive to see in COVID-19, maybe this is something that we could try to look at. So finally, this is really a win-win-win situation. It is a win for the climate, of course. I think it is a win for us as human beings on this planet, living in a more, environmentally friendly and sustainable planet. And I think it's also a win for the sector itself. The cooling sector, like many other sectors, needs to take the next step to remain sustainable. And I think that the cooling climate pathway is really going to help the sector to develop something that will keep them relevant into the future. So I think that is bringing me to the end here of my presentation, and just what's next. And I think the next is maybe David or somebody. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Nicholas, for the very comprehensive presentation. I just want to remind all the participants that any questions you have for Nicholas or Dan so far, please use the chat box on hopefully the right-hand side of your screen to enter questions. And then we will have a Q&A session just after David. So now I'll hand over to David to take us through the early insights from the pathway research. David, over to you. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Lily, and thank you, Dan and Nicholas, for your presentations. Delighted to be here today. David Aitken, Director of Innovation at the Carbon Trust, and working closely with Dan, Lily, and colleagues around this new pathway work. So I guess just to get going, and Marco, if I don't manage to advance the slides, I might call on your good help there, if that's okay. But just some introductory comments. Thank you. This is very much an introductory outline of how we're planning to go about this pathway work. We're not presenting the answers here yet, and very much see the answers being a product of the community's insights and our collective view on how we can get there. And as Dan mentioned, it's a team effort. My colleagues Manu Ravashankar, Paul Huggins, Sophie Bordart, and Emily Northridge have been working hard on this. So what we'd like to do in this presentation is just to share a few thoughts about how we're planning to approach the work and how we're thinking about it. And I'll speak for about 15 minutes so that we have plenty of time for questions or reflections that you may have on how we can best go about the work. So very good. So just to give you a sense of the areas that we'd like to cover, I'll provide some quick background around the project first. We'll then talk about some of the building blocks for the pathway, and so the different elements that we see feeding into building up the pathway that various folks already have described. There'll be a few prompts for discussion around those key building blocks, and hopefully that gets your thinking going around some of the areas that you may want to check, and very much welcome queries in other areas as well. And we'll just outline a few next steps before jumping into the Q&A. So I won't spend too much time talking about the project background, because I think what you've heard already from Lily, Dan, and Nicholas really sets the scene very well. As Lily mentioned, cooling is really central to social and economic development, and a rapidly growing source of greenhouse gas emissions around the world. And to reach net zero, we need huge transformation across a whole range of areas if we're to deliver this pathway. And we talk about reaching zero greenhouse gas emissions here. By that we mean reaching real zero, and also exploring, if there is netting off needed, how much that might be, and how critical is it, what might it mean for some of the other netting off in other sectors. So very much it's looking at how we can transform how cooling is generated, stored, and used, and that's helpful in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and has a range of benefits that Lily and others have talked through. And very much our approach is to build on the existing work that's been done. We're not looking to come to this work with a blank slate and build things up from scratch. We're very much looking to step off the fantastic work that's been done by everyone across the sector already, and look at the additional elements that are needed to understand what the gap is in getting to zero, and importantly, who may need to do what to achieve that. And as Nicholas and others, Dan and co have talked through, this project is very much in support of what the Marrakech Partnership and the Climate Action Pathways Refresh and the work that the COP champions in UN Cool Coalition are doing. So in terms of the objectives, yes, very much it's around understanding, firstly, how do we get to zero? What does that pathway look like? And what are the key assumptions or uncertainties involved with that? And we'd very much like to make that transparent. People will have different views about how this pathway can be achieved, and we're very much looking for others to be able to step off this work and refine it as needed beyond this project. Ultimately, we need people to take action on the back of the pathway if we're to deliver the outcomes that we're all looking for. So we'll also be summarising key actions that stakeholders need to take to deliver this pathway, and using what we develop for cooling, given how cross-cutting it is to other sectors, to help feed into the climate action pathway refreshes that Nicholas and Dan were talking through. So this is something that then they can incorporate in the work that they're doing. I won't go through the detail of this slide. I think the main points to flag around the approach and timescales are that there are multiple opportunities for you to engage, and we're really keen for that feedback around how we develop the pathway and how we go about this work. This Cool Coalition webinar is a very helpful part of that for us, and we've started to have initial discussions with some folks in the sector. Very keen to speak to others, and as Lily mentioned, for those that are interested in a working group under the Cool Coalition, there'll be multiple opportunities to engage, so that we come out with a pathway and a set of actions and a vision that everyone feels they can support and step off from after the project. So perhaps just jumping into the building blocks next to give you a sense of how we're thinking about developing the zero emissions pathway for the cooling sector. Broadly, we see four key building blocks that will help us to get to a robust pathway for zero emissions in the cooling sector. So firstly, given how many sectors cooling touches and how important it is to different areas across energy and transport and human settlements and resilience and various other areas, we're keen to define the sector and think about what's the most effective way to draw boundaries around where we focus and where others will be really leading on the work, and it's more about signposting and directing folks to what others are doing. Secondly, around establishing a counterfactual. So there's various future outlooks for cooling use globally. So setting and understanding what that counterfactual looks like is the second important building block, so that we are clear about what it is that we're mitigating from, and that's very much the third area where work has already started to understand, well, what are the different mitigation measures that can help us get to zero, and ultimately, as we've described in previous slides, that really important component around who needs to deliver this change, what do they need to do, and by when is really what we see as pulling this pathway together into a coherent way forward. I mentioned earlier that we're very much keen to step off work that others have already done in the sector. So looking at the first of those building blocks around defining the sector, we are planning to use the cooling sector breakdown used in the Economist Intelligence Unit's report last year. So essentially splitting the cooling sector into air conditioning and refrigeration, with 4 segments in each of those areas, very much to try and build off some of the work that's been done already. We're conscious this isn't the only way that you could segment the sector, so interested in any reflections on that. In terms of the second building block there, just to give you a sense, as many of you will know, cooling sector growth forecasts do vary depending on different approaches and assumptions that people make, and also the different aims behind the work that's been done already. What's the challenge that they're looking to address? So you'll see a range of scenarios in work that's already been done. We picked out some examples here from work that University of Birmingham and International Energy Agency have done. The main point here is really that there is a range, and the different assumptions that people make about the measures and how we can get there and what gap that closes does lead to some quite significant at times differences in the forecast for how cooling use could build over the coming decades. Similar to the approach earlier around stepping off work on how we can define the sector, we're also very keen to build on the Cool Coalition hierarchy around the mitigation options. So that third building block that we described, to talk through and to think about in terms of that hierarchy, how we can avoid the use for cooling, shift to different ways of delivering cooling, improve how cooling is delivered through some of the existing solutions, as well as the important protect and enable elements there. So in terms of the mitigation approach, we look at this in terms of different options in each of the different sectors and segments that we're looking at, very much informed by the Cool Coalition hierarchy. And in terms of the key actors for change, the high-level stakeholder mapping that we've been engaged in, this is drawing on some work that's already been done in the sector, but very much keen to identify who are the key actors across supply, demand, and enabling organisations in the sector, and what are the things that people need to do for us to get to zero emissions, both within the sort of core focus, if you like, of the cooling ecosystem, and then other actors who may not think of themselves as cooling sector stakeholders first, but that play a really important role in manufacturing equipment, or designing and developing buildings, or supplying the power that's used to operate cooling equipment. Right, so just a few minutes to touch on some of the discussion areas, and then we'll move on to next steps in terms of some discussion points, but very open to what may be most of interest to you. In terms of defining the sector, we are focusing particularly around the energy used for operating the equipment and the refrigerants used in the equipment, as well as considering the building envelope and vehicle envelope that's containing that cooling, albeit there's work that others are also doing in that space. So interested if there are particular cooling demands that you think through the approach that we've followed are not going to be picked up, or not picked up well by some of those classifications, and what some of the key sources are that would help us to really define the sector in the best way, and set that solid baseline for energy and emissions use. Secondly, around that counterfactual, the approach that we are taking is to adopt a cooling for all assumption out to 2050. People have different views on this. Interested in perspectives on whether this is a reasonable assumption, and the extent to which forecasts and models have projected this out, and what some of the implications of these different approaches may be, and also the extent to which these forecasts assume or rely on largely mechanically driven vapor compression technologies delivering that cooling. The third area around mitigation strategy. So, one of the things that's come through from the discussions already is very much that it's important to make sure that we have sufficiently covered each of the areas in this Cool Coalition hierarchy, and in particular, there's a real opportunity to better understand and incorporate some of the avoid measures. And we're very interested in how strong the evidence is around avoid and shift and improve in terms of mitigation, and how we can achieve that cooling for all approach, given the different balance of effort or weighting of effort that may take place between avoid, shift, and improve in particular. Given the interest around the avoid side, and I think there's some complications on that front that we're really keen to make sure that we're fully dived into. So we're really keen to understand the perspective from others around those key challenges in delivering those avoid measures alongside our shift and improve, and also if we're assuming that a lot of the cooling will not be delivered by vapor compression technologies. There are various options out there. How realistic we feel some of the assumptions are around the deployments of some of these other options at scale over the coming decades. And just to round it out in terms of key actors, what are some of the key agreements and approaches that we can look at, both within the cooling sector and adjacent sectors that are helpful in driving change across the key stakeholder types that we see, who these key stakeholders are, what do they need to do, and to what extent is that really something that the cooling sector is driving, and how much can we signpost or direct or try and influence work that others are really leading in other areas, given the extent to which cooling crosscuts various sectors. So in terms of next steps from here, as I mentioned, we're very keen to engage with folks across the sector throughout the project to ensure that we produce outputs that are as useful for the sector as possible, and really provide a platform for others to step off with the various work that everyone is doing in the sector in the future. We'll follow up with a survey link, which will help to enable people to provide quick input into the project. Also very open to having direct discussions with folks, and in addition to people that we engage with during this core part of the project now, there's also the important engagement around the work that thematic leads are doing in terms of the climate action pathway refresh in other areas. So we'd be delighted to hear from you. Really look forward to to your collaboration in this area. And I think with that, it's over to questions and reflections, challenges around how we get there and where we step off from here. So yeah, look forward to an interesting discussion.
Great, thanks, David, and yeah, thank you to the various people that have already put some questions in the chat box. I've been noting them down. I'll just give a few quick answers, and then David, as I repeat the question, you can think of your answer, so you get a little bit of time to catch your breath, assuming you weren't actually reading all those questions while you're also presenting, but you may be even cleverer than I know you are. So we had a question about will the pathway look at solutions such as cooling as a service, and also the importance of servitization, maintenance more generally. Thank you, Richard. I mean, yes, and I can see, a few places where that comes in, given the hierarchy that that David just presented about avoid, shift, improve. You're obviously improving the performance of existing equipment, so there's an obvious kind of slot in there. Question: do we avoid that pathway by finding financial models such as CAS that ensure that we're building in regular maintenance to avoid such degradation? But I certainly think that the door's open there for CAS. Second question, cooling and COVID, Alan. So E3G put out a briefing note recently. Have a look at their website. Just cooling and COVID, and then we've worked together with E3G as well on a KSET brief. I think CCAC or the French government are working on one too, and linking to stimulus. So there's some thoughts flying around, and they sort of highlight both how COVID is increasing the demand for cooling. I wrote a blog as well if you're interested. How COVID is increasing demand for cooling, but also as we build back better, then what are the opportunities to integrate efficient climate-friendly cooling into those stimulus plans? So happy to send the links, Alan. Another question: how do we link a zero pathway to the fact that so many people still don't have access to cooling? I mean, in theory, we've got to be supporting the leapfrogging and the avoidance of the high polluting pathway that much of the world has already gone on, and that brings to mind solar powered fans and cool roofs and passively designed buildings and drying or preserving food right at the start of the cold chain, natural refrigerants and so forth. So I can see a number of options here. Does that mean it's going to be easy? No, it's not. But that we wouldn't all be working on these issues if they were easy. We work on them because they're hard and important. There was a question here which stretches my mental capacity. Does this approach work for cryogenic applications? So David, I'll hand that one over to you. I don't know. I would say if they map on to the approach that we're suggesting, then that's to be explored. Please send us some more information. I think would be helpful there. Question from Jenny. Thank you, Jenny. How do we deal with the different country context? I mean, I have an answer to that. I'll be interested to see what David says. But by starting off with the Economist's breakdown of where the pollution is for cooling, so we've got residential air conditioning, residential refrigeration, commercial, industrial, mobile, etc. We start off with that pollution, and then we apply the avoid, shift, improve, protect approach to that. As we do that, we start to then break down those chunks of pollution to map them onto particular sets of solutions. So if you start with air conditioning at the top, and then you apply an avoid, shift, improve overlay, where you say, well, if you're avoiding air conditioning in a building, what are you doing? Passive cooling, cool roofs, etc. If you're shifting, you're trying to make that building powered more by renewables or district cooling or lower GWP refrigerants. If you're improving, you're working on the MEP. You get the picture. What that kind of leads to is more like a waterfall type approach, which I'm sure many of you have seen. So in some ways, that will result in not just one pathway, but almost like a decision tree or choose your own adventure for anybody who read those books when they were growing up. where you have the opportunity to go down a different pathway that gets you to the end of the story, which is essentially net zero. So absolutely recognise there's not one answer, given the different geographical, climatic, cultural context in which we're dealing with, but a little bit more of a choose your own adventure. So David, they were the questions, they were my answers, but come in, add some stuff on top.
Great, thanks, Dan. Perhaps just I'll try and pick them up in order there. I guess a couple of quick thoughts around the operations and maintenance and cooling as a service. So spot on. Yeah, so cooling as a service is one of the measures that we're looking at on the mitigation side. And I think one of the things that we're interested in is from the work that we've done already, the extent to which nameplate efficiency, if you like, is factored into some of these projections going forward, and how that triangulates to what we've seen in practice in cooling applications, where at times you'll see 10-20% losses in efficiency through lack of cleaning and servicing and updating of set points, these sorts of things on equipment. So I think we're very, very keen to make sure that we're transparent around the assumptions that are made around operations and maintenance and the models that can help to deliver that more effectively, because it's difficult to do, certainly on a product sale and sort of more responsibility then lying with the owner in terms of the operation and use side of things. I guess any further information on the cooling as a service side would be very much welcome. There's some great work that various folks are doing in this space. So very open to any further information you have on that. In terms of COVID, it's an interesting one. I think as Dan mentioned, there's various work that's coming out on this, both directly what does it mean for the cooling sector, and then just more broadly what it might mean for energy use and how people move and live and work and these sorts of things. And I think that is an uncertainty for us to navigate in the work. I guess to an extent, because we are taking a projection out over the coming decades. There are various other uncertainties to juggle as well. So I think it'll be an important element to factor into our analysis. Quite what it looks like yet is perhaps a little early for us to say. So I think that'll be an interesting area to keep an eye on as things develop. The question about how the pathway links to people who don't have access. I mean, this is something that we have discussed a lot already, and I suspect we'll continue to discuss what is the right approach. The basis that we're working on is that we would like to develop a pathway that doesn't clash development and sustainability, and that maps out how we can both provide people with the cooling that they need, which in many cases is critical to their health and well-being and productivity, and also how do we get there in a way that is consistent with the Paris Agreement and the significant reductions that we know we need to make in the transition towards net zero. So I think the work that's been done already in the sector is super helpful. People have different assumptions around the extent to which people do get access to cooling, or when they get it by, and so that's one of the things that we're trying to triangulate at the moment, and try and make sure that, particularly in considering that counterfactual as well as the mitigation options, how do we robustly include both that the people have access to cooling, and also that we've appropriately factored in the various measures into the mitigation hierarchies. But we recognise this is an area that people can and may challenge in terms of the basis that we're taking the work forward on. The cryogenic applications is an interesting one, and yes, very open on this one as well to further work. and further engagement. I guess you could imagine the cryogenic applications in a couple of ways. One is the extent to which it's using energy itself for cryogenic solutions being used to deliver solutions in other areas, and then cryogenics themselves as a helpful model in the cooling sector. So the extent to which we can use liquid air as an energy storage mechanism in some of these types of approaches. So both on the enabling side and then also the energy use side. So yeah, any further insights or information on that would be very much welcome. The different country context is an interesting one, and I think something that in the work we're not able to do a full sort of country by country breakdown in what we're doing, and as Dan said, we're very much stepping off from the classifications in the economists' work, and thinking about what that looks like across different segments and intervention measures. But we are also looking to cross-check that against some key countries to make sure that we've factored in what does that look like in a different context, and particularly when it gets to the stakeholders, who needs to do what by when. That can look quite different from one country or region to the next. So yeah, it's a very important point. Thank you.
Great, thanks, David. So a few more questions have come through. Thank you. So we can tag team again. One of them is actually for you, Lily. So we'll come to you in a second. There's a question about the potential for district cooling. So you come to that one. Okay, and then Nicholas, actually, you may have some reflections on any of what's just come through. So after we've done our download, then happy to pass you the microphone. There was a question about wouldn't a carbon tax just sort this out? And many people have said that before. I think my answer to that is, well, economically speaking, yes, it probably would. And I'm a fan of taxing the bad and supporting the good, as good economics does. But the reality of that is much harder than just saying it. So what I can say, though, is that we are developing pathways for the role of the financial community. And as Nicholas said, the role of finance as a cross-cutting solution is recognised by the Marrakech Partnership pathways. And I don't know the extent to which those pathways are advocating for the carbon tax, but that's where they'll be picked up. And just to note as well that we're not going to try and solve all of the world's problems within the cooling pathway. Where we recognise a link with a wider set of solutions or problems, then we will do signposting from the cooling pathway to direct somebody, for example, to the built environment pathway. So we're not going to rewrite the pathway for the built environment for passive design in this pathway. There's a strong cooling component, but of course there's a heating component as well when it comes to passive buildings, and there's a lighting component as well. So we're not going to do all that. We're going to do some signposting to try and make it as easy as possible for decision makers and users of these pathways to navigate them. Question, Alan, thank you. Large manufacturers, this is great. David, somebody's asked it. So we've been looking at this actually. You referenced EP100, which is sort of a climate club of companies that are actually mostly, I think they're all wholly on the demand side. Actually, no, so that's not true. Sorry, Johnson Controls and a few others are in there. Apologies. On the supply as well as the demand side. What we've actually been doing recently, David and Manu and the team, is looking at who's made a science-based target from the cooling sector. And I don't know if anybody on this call knows that. I put my hand up, I didn't know that. And actually using also the recently launched CDP report, which assessed the world's 18 largest cooling manufacturers by market share, assess them for their carbon climate performance, as well as the risks to the transition to a net zero resilient world. Electrolux, actually, it looks like, have the most ambitious target, that they have both an SBTi and a commitment to go carbon neutral by 2030. Mitsubishi also have an science-based target. Daikin have a 2050 target, but it's not particularly grounded in the science of net zero, I think is a diplomatic way of saying it. Go and have a look. And a few others, but this is actually going to be an interesting exercise to go down, which is which cooling manufacturers and frankly large consumers of cooling have made commitments to science-based targets or net zero or the Undersea Coalition, etc., etc., etc. And what are they actually proposing to do? And does that get us to zero or not? So that's something we're grappling with, and would love anybody's feedback on that. District cooling, Lily, I'll leave that one for you. And then another question about banning cooling if the temperature is less than 30 degrees or the temperature is less than 22 degrees. For a deep breath, I think that's an incredibly hard thing to do. Maybe the French would get away with it. I doubt they actually would, to be honest. I think we need to be, cognizant of the different cooling needs that people have. I mean, if somebody's ill, dying, old, then their requirement for thermal comfort could be way different from somebody who is really fit and healthy and so forth. So I think it's very hard to suggest sort of banning the use of cooling equipment when it comes to temperatures. We need to, as a community, we need to be much smarter about the solutions that we can provide to the world community that cater for different cultures and geographies and health conditions and so forth. So David, over to you, and then Lily, do you want to come in on district cooling, and then Nicholas maybe after that?
Great, thank you. Yeah, like Dan, I will very much defer to Lily as the guru on district cooling. So yeah, perhaps just picking up on some of the other queries, wouldn't a carbon tax just sort this out? I think price on carbon is likely to be a necessary but insufficient measure for ultimately achieving this pathway. If we look back at sort of various economic work that's been done, Stern Review and others, typically the carbon price is one of a number of measures that need to be taken. It's largely a market pull mechanism, and there's various push mechanisms around innovation support and various other things that are needed. So I think a price on carbon is helpful, and it's been interesting to see the extent to which carbon pricing is again becoming something that countries and regions are using as a mechanism to take action. We think additional things would be needed alongside that to drive the change that's needed. I think on the large manufacturer side, I think Dan has picked up on some really important points there. I think the other thing that perhaps just to add to what Dan mentioned is we're very interested as well in what are the different things that might influence different types of manufacturers in different places to take action. Manufacturers that might be located in different countries, or smaller manufacturers, or medium-sized manufacturers, and what might be effective for them, relative to what we might see from some of the larger global manufacturers. Do we see meaningful action taken by some of the more medium-sized manufacturers feeling like they're part of a group of countries that are national champions, if you like, for driving progress in a particular place? And there's some interesting work in Southeast Asia, Thailand, and elsewhere on that others might want to speak to. So yeah, I think any reflections as well as what can be done, what that might look like in different places, which again sort of picks up on the earlier comment around how we bring a country lens to that. And yeah, banning cooling if the temperature is less than 30 degrees. Yeah, I think it's regulation has an important role to play, and I think it's likely to be nuanced in different places. What works in one area may not work in another. Like Dan, my inclination would be that just a straight out ban applied everywhere is unlikely to be passed. And I think there are some important other considerations, social and economic, to factor in there as well, which are important to bear in mind with any measure that we take. It's not just about, well, what are the environmental implications? It's the social and economic side as well. If ultimately people are going to buy into to the change that we're looking to achieve. So yeah, I think an important role for regulation, useful to think about what that might look like. And there are various mechanisms already that we can build off that provide an architecture for action. But yeah, over to Lily on the district cooling, and any comments from Nicholas.
Sure. So I think, yeah, of course, district cooling is one of the important solutions. It always depends with district cooling on the local conditions and the local context. But in urban areas where you have sufficient density, certainly district cooling provides a often more efficient solution because you can aggregate demand across buildings and you can shave peak, and you also can use storage solutions such as I don't know, day or night cold storage or ice, and that's the reason why you can have significant efficiency savings up to 50% of primary energy for urban cooling savings over traditional solutions. But again, it's dependent on the local conditions. I think it's also important because you can, where possible, you can use where there is excess heat from industry or waste heat from different sources like sewage, wastewater treatment plant, or a variety of other solutions like from the metro system, like they're doing in London, or also using like river water cooling like they do in Paris and etc. Then you can also use not in kind technologies. So in the ozone, in the Montreal Protocol, under the Montreal Protocol, they call them not in kind. Like absorption chillers and such, where you're also you're using no or low GWP refrigerants. So you're therefore combining both the phase down of HFCs with the improvement of energy efficiency, and therefore gaining those benefits. And of course, because you're aggregating demand across buildings, you can integrate large renewable energy sources like geothermal for cooling, or other large renewable sources that would not be sustainable on the level of, well, would not necessarily be economically feasible at the level of one building. So there's certainly a lot of advantages, and we see that it is increasingly being used across the Middle East, Japan, the US, Korea, I mean, China and Europe. You see it growing, but I should say that again, we still have a long way to go in terms of increasing that kind of infrastructure investment, or investment in that kind of infrastructure. If you look at the EU, we have like maybe, I think, 3 terawatt hours of district cooling, and EU is quite a champion on district cooling. So we have quite a way to go. I think that's 1 or 2% of market share, but it is an important solution, and it will be one of the solutions that will be looked at in the zero emission pathway for cooling. I hope that answers the question.
Great, thanks, Lily. Nicholas, did you want to comment on anything?
Yeah, sure. A lot of stuff, actually. I mean, I really enjoyed the discussion and the questions here. Maybe just a few things I want to pick up on that was already commented, but maybe add 1 or 2 points to it. This issue about banning cooling is quite interesting, because it's a little bit like banning flying. And if you said this half year ago, people said, impossible, we all need to fly. Now, 98.6% of flights are canceled. That doesn't mean that this is a pleasant experience, or that is something that is working for the economy. It's certainly not working for the sector. And I think, to actually define this pathway as a successful pathway, reducing the cooling need is, of course, one thing that you can do and that you should do. But it's also about increasing efficiency, introducing new technologies, increasing awareness among consumers, and so on. And I think that is the way that we will go here. On the issue of carbon tax, what we have seen across all the climate action pathway is that carbon pricing overall is very, very important, because in our daily behavior we react a lot to the price signal. whether we are environmentally aware or not, this is important. But there are different things, there are different ways to send that signal. Carbon tax is one thing, but there's a difference then between adding a new tax or shifting from existing taxes on labor or services product and to really tax the carbon footprint instead. So you don't increase the carbon the taxing pressure, but you redirect, on to encourage certain behaviors. You can of course also in the same way you can shift investments. You can try to make it more attractive to invest in certain kind of technologies or behaviors than others. And it's not necessarily about always adding more money, but it's using the monies that are already invested in this sector, but put it into more sustainable solutions. And we have seen that in the building construction sector, for example, that a huge potential win in terms of emission reduction in the building sector is really in using existing technologies and upgrading the buildings that we have. And it's not very much more expensive than investing in the old technologies. It's just that you need to push it in that direction. And then of course removing fossil fuel subsidies, like everybody else. I think that is something that needs to happen. And I think the very low oil and gas prices that we're seeing right now, fossil fuel prices overall, it's a good opportunity to start thinking about actually really implementing removal of subsidies. Okay, so maybe just one more point I want to add, because we are living in the world of COVID-19 right now, and I think there's a lot of and I think many people have made this observation that COVID-19 is like the small crisis that is teaching us how the big crisis will be, and the big crisis in this case will be climate change. And what we have seen there is that there are many similarities. COVID-19, we knew it was about to happen, and if we have listened to science, we could possibly have avoided it, and we didn't. We know that in order to deal with this, we cannot have a me-first attitude. It has to be we work together. What we call inclusive multilateralism is key to solving the COVID crisis. It's going to be the same thing for climate change. And as usual, it's the most vulnerable people who are most badly affected. For some of us, we're just working from home and that's it. It's not a big deal. For others, you're losing your job and your livelihood, and you're getting sick and probably even losing your lives, and that is very, very bad. So the issue about cooperation, about being science-based and so on, are important markers also for the work on cooling, I think. And maybe just the last point here in that case is that when I mentioned that this climate action pathway on cooling needs to fit with other climate action pathways, it's not, as you said, David, I think it's not about rewriting the other pathways, but it's about fitting them in together. And that is a little bit of the beauty of what we're doing in the Marrakech Partnership, is that we are bringing together all these different organizations that are developing the different pathways to collaborate and to peek into each other's works and to learn from each other and see what we can do. So personally, I am quite optimistic that we can achieve a lot in this way, and I'm really, really very happy to see this pathway for the cooling sector also, being born here. So good luck. Great. And thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you. I'm conscious of the time, so I've got to give Mark 5 minutes. There were 4 more questions, and I will try and address them in 1 minute. So, Fionnuala, do we need to look at refrigerant leakage at end of life? Yes. I mean, we can't ask the question about getting to zero if we don't look at that. So something more has to be done on improving decommissioning and disposal. Benoit, is there enough money to deliver this? No, simple answer. But one thing to flag is the work will also identify the key initiatives that exist in the world that are moving us forward on the pathway to zero. So there will be an effort to link this to action and to land this in the context of conversations at COP26 about what more is needed. Commitments on climate finance, I'm sure, will come forward from the public and private sector when we get to November next year. Harriet, universities, should we be engaging, air conditioning, etc.? Yes, there's 500 universities already in the race to zero. So my question is, are they thinking about their cooling systems? Maybe a bit, maybe not enough. So there should be an open door there. And then a fourth question from Johannes, about a big one. Are we going to link the specific policies to GHGs? And I think the answer is yes. Of course, this is difficult and contested. And the approach that we're at least thinking of now is if we assume some of the estimates of the emissions reduction potential from particular policies, typically they add up to more than maybe we need if we achieved all of them, but we never do. And so we're thinking of having a sort of hedging strategy of including more than we need on the pathway to zero, noting that we'll have to discount some of those policies and some of the other non-policy solutions in the reality of how we actually do this over the next couple of decades. All I can say is we're also developing a list of products. Somebody mentioned products. Which products are compatible with the pathway to zero? Colleagues at the EIA are doing that, working with the economists to do some quantification of the contribution of cooling to decarbonisation in energy and transport, to try and strengthen these links between the other chapters. Let us know if you want to join the working group. Thank you all for the feedback. Mark, over to you.
Thank you, everyone. What brought us together today was a series of 3 presentations on the subject of how do we get on a pathway for zero greenhouse gas emissions in the cooling sector. After a bit of context setting by Lily, we moved on to a presentation by Dan on the race to zero, which he described as an aggregator and escalator of non-state actor net zero commitments that build momentum toward COP26. Dan went on to describe how cooling in the cooling sector fits into the race to zero. Nicholas then reminded us of the science that underpins the action that was described today, and the international response, a sort of climate science and COP 101. But he went on to describe how actions by non-state actors fit into the global framework, putting particular emphasis on the global climate action, and reminded us that it is science-based. Again, anchoring cooling within the global climate action framework. Nicholas reminded us that any action in this sector ideally, or I would say must be linked to actions on other pathways. I think a point that Dan made as well. So no siloed approaches, no narrow thinking, no focusing only on one part of the overall puzzle and neglecting other parts. We've been down that road many times and don't want to repeat. David went on to describe the pathway research, a collective effort, basically the how do we get there on the zero pathway. 4 building blocks for zero emission cooling. He described it as a blueprint and the action. So who needs to do what by when? Outlined the approach very succinctly and made an appeal for inputs in 4 areas: defining the cooling sector, building a counterfactual against which actions could be measured, describing more precisely the mitigation area, and bringing clarity to the key actors, again, the who. We then went on to a range of good questions covering quite a few topics: economics, policy, technology. Some of them I would posit don't have easy answers, but as Dan said, if this was easy, we wouldn't be doing it. I think what came out very clearly was the imperative of getting cooling right. We, in the climate context, much can be done, much needs to be done, and so what we really need to do is just get on doing it. My thanks to Lily, Dan, Nicholas, David for your presentations, my colleagues who pulled this together under the rubric of KSEP and the Cool Coalition. I think we're a little bit over time, so I'm going to just seize the imperative here and thank you all in the audience for being with us. We had over 100 people and still quite close to that number. You could have been anywhere else this hot afternoon in Paris. For me, thank you for being with us, and press on, everybody. It's a good fight. Bye-bye now.
Just before we say bye, I need to thank 2 more people. Oh no, did everybody disconnect? No, everyone's there. Can you hear me? I just want to thank, I just really need to thank also Sophie Laurent, who's like co-leading on this, on the Cool Coalition as well, and leading advocacy outreach for pulling this together, and also the rest of the team, Irene and Marco, who were also very key in making this work. So you will hear from us for the recording and the summary and the presentations, and I just wanted to give thanks to the other members of the team. Sorry for that. Okay, bye.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.